Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Edelstein, the director, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here, and also those who are joining us online. It is my pleasure to introduce you the speaker of this evening, and that is Bruce Edelstein. Has been named the first distinguished arts professor in New York University Global Network after having served for over 2 decades as coordinator for graduate programs and advanced research at New York University in Florence. He has held fellowships at Reliance and the Kunsthistorisch Instituut in Florence, and for the current academic year, he is visiting senior research fellow at the Medici Archive Project and visiting scholar here with us at the NIKI. Great having you here. Professor Edelstein's research focuses primarily on 16th century Medici court patronage on art and architecture in viceregal Naples and relations between Italy and Habsburg Spain. His books include, and there they all come, the whole list. Andrea del Sarto and the Creation of the Boboli Gardens, that was published in 2022, and the exhibition catalogs, Miraculous Encounters, Pontormo from Drawing to Painting. And those exhibitions were held between 2018 and 19 at Palazzo Pitti, then the Morgan Library and Museum, and then the final venue was the Getty Museum. And the other exhibition catalogue curated was Eleonora di Toledo e l'invenzione della Corte dei Medici a Firenze, and that was an exhibition held at the Uffizi in 2023. Currently, Professor Edelstein is researching the patronage collecting and display of Medici portraiture in 16th century Florence. This project examines the rapid expansion of Italian portraiture during the 15th and 16th centuries, when new social groups became subjects of representation and innovative portrait types emerged. By considering how portraits were used, where they were displayed, and the cultural frameworks that informed their appearance, this study proposes new perspectives on why these works were made and how they were meant to be understood. In his talk this evening, entitled Pontormo's Portraits, From His Origins to the Halberdier, Professor Edelstein addresses the influences and sources that Pontormo assimilated in less than 2 decades in order to become one of the greatest portrait painters in early modern European art. Ruth, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction. And then before I begin, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you, to thank Gert-Jan, to thank Ilaria, to thank Lex for the wonderful hospitality that you have all provided for me in this sabbatical year, or something very unusual, to have had a sabbatical, and a great pleasure to have been able to spend it here. It has been just fantastic to be part of this community, and a wonderful opportunity for scholarly exchange with colleagues, researchers, visiting students, all of whom it has been a pleasure to meet. Okay, let's see if I can do this correctly. Right. There we go. So Pontormo is known to us today as one of the most powerful and original portrait painters of the 16th century. It is due in no small part to the fame of his greatest masterpiece in this genre, the so-called Portrait of a Halberdier in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. By the time he executed this work, Pontormo was about 35 years old, a well-established artist with an exceptional reputation as one of the leading painters in Florence. His earliest forays in this genre, however, were more modest and demonstrate his reliance on the models of his masters before assimilating the ideas of outstanding contemporaries in Rome and Venice, leading to the innovative portraits of his maturity. So in essence, what I'm going to try to do this evening is to figure out how we get from what we see on the left in this slide to what we see on the right. Pontormo's exceptional openness to innovation and originality was no doubt cultivated from the moment of his earliest training as an artist. The son of a painter, Pontormo was left orphaned as a young boy and raised by his maternal grandmother, Brigida. At the age of 13, she brought him to Florence, consigning him to the care of the Magistratura dei Pupilli, the civic office responsible for the oversight of minors whose fathers had died without naming a guardian. 13 was a typical age in Florence to begin an apprenticeship. And just a few months after arriving in Florence, Jacopo was placed in the workshop of his first master, Leonardo da Vinci. And I should say here that our recognition that this claim that Pontormo's earliest master was in fact Leonardo was something that was long doubted as a kind of legend, a story told by Vasari, and it really was due to the 2001 monograph written by Elizabeth Pilliard on Pontormo, Bronzino, and Allori that this idea was really first taken seriously in the modern literature. Upon his return to Florence after 17 years at the Sforza court in Milan, Leonardo created some of his most original compositions. Although he completed none of them before he left Florence again, he was unusually generous in sharing his ideas and allowing other artists to see his drawings. His revolutionary ideas for altarpieces, small devotional works, and history paintings were thus rapidly imitated by other artists working in Florence. In Leonardo's workshop from 1507 to 1508, Pontormo would have understood that these were especially admired for the novelty of their compositions. Of course, one of Leonardo's most fruitful inventions was his conception for the Gioconda, unfinished and still present in his workshop while Pontormo was learning to paint. The incomplete state of the work means that artists who saw it in Florence probably had little opportunity to assimilate Leonardo's ideas about sfumato, but the composition was quickly adopted as the new standard for portrait formats. Two artists especially sensitive to the innovations of this work were the young Raphael and Andrea del Sarto, in whose workshop Pontormo arrived after brief stints in those of Mariotto Albertinelli and Piero di Cosimo. A damaged fragment of a portrait of a woman has a strong claim to being Pontormo's earliest surviving attempt in this genre. And I'd like to thank Anna Bisceglia for recently providing me with an exceptional opportunity to study this work at the Palazzo Pitti. It's a painting that I had doubts about, and after being able to spend some quality time with it, given its current condition, the fact that it is a fragment, I am more convinced than ever that the attribution to Pontormo is almost certainly correct. The traditional misidentification of this work as a painting by Andrea del Sarto confirms the young Pontormo's strong dependence on his example in works such as the Portrait of a Woman, which we see here on the right in the Prado, and the Dama con Cestino di Fusi, which I didn't illustrate, but you can go to the Uffizi and take a look at yourself. Andrea's paintings, in turn, relied less on the direct example of the Gioconda than on Raphael's reinterpretation of this model in portraits such as La Gravida, which we're seeing here, and La Muta, now in the Galleria Nazionale delle Marche in Urbino. Works probably painted in Florence by Raphael, while Pontormo was serving his apprenticeship in Leonardo's workshop. The costume details still visible in Pontormo's painting confirm its chronological proximity to these prototypes, and the current bust was most likely once a similar half-length format that included the hands of the sitter. A more complete idea of Pontormo's early style as a portrait painter is provided by the slightly later Portrait of a Goldsmith. Here, Pontormo, still strongly reliant on the examples of both Andrea del Sarto and Raphael, begins to emerge as an autonomous painter with a recognizable individual style. Although Pontormo had already been evicted from Andrea's workshop by this date, the work is strongly indebted to the latter's contemporary male portraits, such as the portrait of a young man in the National Gallery in London. The rotation of the head in opposition to the rotation of the body, the arm crossing the chest, leading to a hand engaged in an identifying activity, and the inclusion of a portion of a work table to provide the viewer a stronger perception of the figure's presence in a three-dimensional space, all find precursors in Andrea's work. Andrea, in turn, appears to have been at least partially inspired by a recent invention of Raphael for a Florentine patron in Rome, his portrait of Bindo Altoviti. Pontormo's work is somewhat less ambitious than these, depicting the sitter in a more traditional frontal view that appears to rotate Raphael's and Andrea's sitters. The result is compositionally closer to what had probably served as an inspiration to both Raphael and Andrea, Leonardo's Portrait of a Lady with an Ermine, although the psychological effect is perhaps closest to Leonardo's less innovative Portrait of a Musician. Pontormo could not have seen either of these works in person, but he may have seen preparatory drawings for them when he was a student in Leonardo's workshop. Various attempts have been made to identify Pontormo's sitter with one of the known goldsmiths active in Florence in the years in which this was likely painted. However, I'd like to remind us that his fashionable costume, especially the expensive fur lining of his doublet emerging at the collar, may suggest that he was instead a member of a higher social class with a dilettante's passion for metalwork or the restoration of ancient coins or bronze statuettes. In the years between executing these two portraits, Pontormo may have painted others that are lost to us today. He would certainly have continued developing ideas about portraits and making drawings of subjects. Indeed, Pontormo's drawings constitute one of the largest surviving corpuses by a 16th century Florentine painter, the vast majority of which are figure studies, including some that must have been for portraits that were either never executed or do not survive. Following a long-standing Florentine tradition, Pontormo also included portraits in other works depicting narrative subjects. A particularly famous example occurs in one of his contributions to the decorations of the Borgherini bedchamber, Joseph with Jacob in Egypt, a painting that Vasari claimed was la più bella pittura che il Pontormo facesse mai. Here, Vasari identified the boy seated on the stairs in the foreground, right here, as depicting the young Bronzino during the period of his apprenticeship in the master's shop. The painting surely contains other portraits, such as the man dressed in red, climbing the stairs on the right side, although his identity remains controversial. Full recognition of Pontormo's talents as a portrait painter arrived with a commission for a commemorative, posthumous portrait of Cosimo the Elder de' Medici. Vasari reports that this was executed for Messer Goro da Pistoia, allora segretario dei Medici. Gregorio, called Goro, Getty, was a staunch Medici partisan named Bishop of Fano in 1518 by Leo X, and who served as secretary and advisor to Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, in his administration of Florence prior to the arrival of Cardinal Silvio Passerini, who served subsequently in a similar role. His role in mediating Lorenzo's artistic patronage has long been recognized, but as recently pointed out by Hélène Mies, no evidence exists in Gary's extensive correspondence to confirm Vasari's statement. Still, there is no reason to doubt that he was the real patron of the work, and I should say that this has been something that has been highly contentious. Both Ottaviano de' Medici, who later owned the work, have been proposed as the true patron of this work, and Leo X himself. But I think we really have to follow Vasari's indication here and retain Goro as the real patron of the work. The portrait was likely commissioned by Goro shortly after the death of his advisee on the 4th of May, 1519, a moment of great crisis for the Medici, since Lorenzo was the last legitimate male descendant of the main branch of the family, the branch that was founded by Cosimo the Elder. In an istruzione sent to Leo X, Goro advised the Pope on how to ensure the continuance of the family line and maintain Medici authority in Florence, specifying the need to recall the example provided by Cosimo the Elder, Piero the Gaudy, and Lorenzo the Magnificent, who had governed civilmente et onorevolmente questa Repubblica. The commission to Pontormo was clearly linked to Goro's political outlook, intended to keep vivid the memory of this important Medici ancestor. Indeed, the survival of several studies by Pontormo for a companion portrait of Piero the Gaudy suggests that the portraits were intended to make these earlier Medici into exemplars, to inspire current members of the family and their advisors. It is unclear whether Pontormo ever completed a painted version of the portrait of Piero the Gaudy, but several known works depicting him attributed to his followers either suggest that he did, and that these are replicas of a lost work, or, as seems more probable, that he loaned his drawings to students in order to complete painted versions of their own, modeled on the example of his portrait of Cosimo. Goro also recommended that Leo send Ippolito de' Medici back to Florence, adding that he should marry Lorenzo Duca Urbino's daughter, Caterina dei Medici, per avere questa casa tanto bisogno di successione. Pontormo's portrait alludes specifically to the necessity of new offspring through the inclusion of the broncone, the dead stump of a laurel tree with a new shoot, which formed an impresa with a phrase derived from Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, uno avulso non deficit alter. This device had already been employed by the Medici in the 15th century, but it acquired new meaning in 1513 when it was adopted by the younger Lorenzo during the carnival celebration sponsored by him and his uncle Giuliano following the return of the Medici to Florence in the previous year after 17 years of exile. In the canto that concluded the celebrations of Lorenzo's Compagnia del Broncone, the significance of the device was sung clearly in a text written by the historian Jacopo Nardi. Torna il secol felice, e come la Fenice rinasce del broncon del vecchio alloro, così nasce dal ferro un secolo d'oro. The inclusion of the broncone with the banderole, bearing the Virgilian text of the impresa, makes Pontormo's Cosimo the Elder an outstanding example of an allegorical portrait, a term often misused in the literature to justify the identification of a portrait subject with a sitter that the work does not resemble. As its name suggests, an allegorical portrait must contain elements in addition to the sitter that suggest a more complex symbolic reading of the work. In this case, the painting is not only a recognizable likeness of the sitter, since Pontormo derived his profile from a medal struck to celebrate Cosimo's Pater Patriae shortly after his death in 1464, but it also includes the broncone impresa, adding a symbolic element to the work. One interpretation of the painting posits that it was meant to allude to the birth of Cosimo de' Medici on the 11th of June, 1519. While this is possible, it is not certain, and the appeal of associating Pontormo's painting with this event may only have occurred subsequently, when Cosimo succeeded to the ducal throne in 1537, following the assassination of his cousin Alessandro, the first Duke of Florence. And I have very strong doubts that the real intended new shoot of the broncone was supposed to be Cosimo. The painting was probably commissioned before he was born, and even if it had been commissioned shortly after his birth, there was no specific reason for Getty to have wanted to commemorate him. Also, people were very hesitant to commemorate infants because of the high infant mortality rate at this time. The words of Goro Getty's Istruzione suggest more strongly that the patron himself would have identified the new shoot of the dead laurel tree with the 8-year-old Ippolito de' Medici, son of Giuliano, Duke of Milan. Vasari reports that the portrait of Cosimo the Elder attracted the attention of Ottaviano de' Medici, who subsequently owned the painting. The great collector and Medici tastemaker was so impressed by it that he extended his patronage to Pontormo, ensuring that he was commissioned to paint the Vertumnus and Pomona lunette at Poggio a Caiano. Pontormo's involvement in this complex collaborative context for the fresco decoration of the Salone of the Medici villa must have kept him greatly occupied, leaving little time to execute autonomous portraits. His next known portrait has been dated on stylistic grounds to circa 1523 or 1524. This remarkable double portrait of two friends finally shows Pontormo as a fully mature painter of portraits. The greater naturalism of the sitter's features, their more complex rotation in space, and the gazes and gestures that consciously engage the spectator all contribute to the powerful psychological effect of this portrait. The work has long been identified with one described by Vasari as a portrait of due suoi amicissimi. Although Vasari did not know their names, he knew that one was the Genero di Beccuccio Bicchieraio, a wealthy glassmaker who had been an important patron of Andrea del Sarto. Elizabeth Cropper has suggested the likelihood that both men depicted were sons-in-law of Beccuccio. The clearly legible text held by the sitter on the left reproduces a passage in Latin from Cicero's De Amicitia, celebrating the friendship between the philosopher Gaius Laelius and Scipio Africanus. In this fictive dialogue, Laelius speaks to his sons-in-law, and Cropper has suggested that the portrait might have been commissioned by Beccuccio himself as a visual analogy to the Ciceronian text. I find this a highly appealing idea. Carol Plazzotta has further observed that Cicero extolled friendship in the dialogue for its ability to make, quote, the absent present and bring the dead to life, claims that were later made for portraiture by Leon Battista Alberti in his treatise De Pictura. Pontormo's double portrait owes much to Sarto's example, but new influences contributed to his ability to craft an original compositional idea and convey an autonomous style. Philippe Costamagna, recognizing the Venetian character of the painting, suggested that this was due to Pontormo having seen Giorgione's portrait of Giovanni Borgherini and his tutor, then in Florence, in the collection of his heirs. Certainly, having contributed to the decoration of the famous bedchamber of Pier Francesco Borgherini, Pontormo may well have had an opportunity to see this work in their family palace. However, the compositional ideas owe more to another artist, influenced by Venetian portraits, then arriving in Rome, Raphael, who transformed these innovations into original creations of his own. Pontormo's double portrait has often been associated with Raphael's self-portrait with a friend in the Louvre, most likely a depiction of the master with his greatest pupil, Giulio Romano, a work, interestingly, once misattributed to Pontormo himself. And even more curious, both Pontormo's and Raphael's double portraits were at one point in each of their histories misidentified as portraits of Luther and Calvin. Pontormo's depictions of his friends is even closer, however, in spirit to Raphael's slightly earlier double portrait of his friends, Andrea Navagero and Agostino Beazzano. And I am reassured in this identification because I recently realized that this had already been suggested by Linda Walk-Simon, who's such a fine scholar of Raphael's works. How Pontormo could have known Raphael's Roman works, however, remains uncertain. Antonio Natali has hypothesized an otherwise undocumented journey to Rome made in the company of Andrea del Sarto and Rosso Fiorentino around 1511 to 1512, which would be too early to have seen either of Raphael's double portraits. John Sherman suggested that Andrea del Sarto, Franciabigio, and Pontormo traveled to Rome in connection with the commission for the Salone of Poggio a Caiano, at least partially supportive of Vasare's Life of Andrea, which confirms that Sarto traveled to Rome probably shortly after the death of Raphael in 1520. However, neither Vasari nor any other known documentary source confirms Pontormo's presence in Rome at this date, by which time, in any case, the portrait of Navagero and Beazzano was presumably in Venice or Padua. Pontormo's special interest, however, in Raphael's example may have been partly due to the fact that the Urbinate was the first to predict a brilliant future for him when he was a teenage apprentice in the workshop of Mariotto Albertinelli. And Pontormo's relationship to Raphael and Raphael's example has been very much on my mind. I'm just back from L'Aquila, where the exhibition has opened, uniting Raphael's Visitation, which has returned to L'Aquila for the first time since it was confiscated by the Spanish crown in 1655, and it has been paired together with Pontormo's remarkable Carmignano Visitation in a wonderful little exhibition curated by Tom Henry and Federica Zalabra. While Pontormo was painting the double portrait, a devastating outbreak of the plague in Florence inspired him to retreat from the city to the Certosa di Galluzzo in the company of his student Bronzino. Although he was now isolated from the social world of Florence that usually generated commissions for portraits, Vasari reports that he painted a remarkably lively depiction of a lay member of the community over the door of one of the chapels. This ritratto di un frate converso, e quale allora era vivo ed aveva 120 anni, unfortunately no longer survives. But evidence for Pontormo's portrait style at this moment is provided by his separate Emmaus, which includes portraits of other Carthusians as witnesses to the miraculous apparition of Christ to his disciples after the resurrection. A powerful portrait study for the two monks seen on the left side of the painting survives in the British Museum. And one of these is, of course, the patron of this work, Leonardo di Giovanni Bonafede. On the other side of the same sheet, Pontormo executed a remarkable self-portrait, almost nude, which he must have drawn with the aid of a mirror. This exquisite red chalk study attests to the artist's now continual need to execute life studies. In the absence of models other than the Carthusian monks themselves and Bronzino, Pontormo studied human anatomy even from his own naked form. Upon his return to Florence, Pontormo received an important commission once again through the mediation of Ottaviano de' Medici. Following the election of the second Medici Pope, Clement VII, Cardinal Silvio Passerini was sent to govern Florence together with the young Ippolito, who made his official entry into the city on the 30th of August, 1524. The following year, his cousins Alessandro and Caterina also returned to Florence on the 19th of June, 1525. Vasari records that Ottaviano ordered portraits of both male cousins from Pontormo, works that he praised for their verisimilitude. Vasari would have been an excellent judge of the two young Medici's appearance, since he studied daily alongside them under the tutelage of the humanist Piero Valeriano at this time. Neither portrait survives, but some idea of their compositional format may be derived from a splendid study in the Uffizi, the most complete surviving portrait drawing by Pontormo, which is likely for the portrait of Ippolito. Questions about the identity of the sitter in this drawing have centered around the question of whether or not he is accompanied by a dog, since Vasari specifically praised Pontormo's depiction of Ippolito's favorite hunting dog, Rodon, in the finished portrait. Nonetheless, the drawing would not need to include the dog for it to be a study for the lost portrait. Some idea of what the finished paintings might have looked like is provided by Pontormo's Ritratto di Giovanetto in Lucca. Although this painting has sometimes been identified as the lost portrait of Alessandro, this idea has failed to convince most scholars. In any case, I think we should not discard this idea entirely. I follow Antonio Geremica in this, in leaving the possibility open that the portrait may return to being identified as the lost portrait of Alessandro. In any case, the portrait in Lucca must have been executed around the same time as these two Medici commissions. Drawing and the painting make clear that Pontormo was responding to the arrival in Florence in May of 1525 of Sebastiano del Piombo's magnificent portrait of Anton Francesco degli Albizzi. While Pontormo did not attempt to imitate the exceptional rendering of the tactile qualities of fur and luxury textiles in Sebastiano's portrait, he was deeply affected by the Venetian's compositional idea, and his sitter stands in a similar pose, slightly rotated from the picture plane, resting his hand on a table. Pontormo also avoided the challenge presented by Sebastiano's masterful rendering of Albizzi's foreshortened extended left arm by showing his youth with a bent arm, hand against his hip. A similar pose had been employed earlier by Raphael in his portrait of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino. Completed in February 1518, it was sent briefly to Florence before being sent on to France with other gifts presented to Lorenzo's bride, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne. Lorenzo's orders to Raphael in Rome were mediated by Goro Getty, who confirmed the arrival of the painting in Florence and his own satisfaction with it prior to Lorenzo himself even being able to see it. As we have seen, Pontormo was working for Gary at this time on the posthumous portrait of Cosimo the Elder, so he may well have been able to view the painting shortly after its execution. In any case, the painting likely returned to Florence a few months later when Madeleine arrived in the city. If the youth in the portrait in Lucca lacks the swagger and courtly bravado of Raphael and Sebastiano's sitters, his more modest demeanor may also have been viewed as more appropriate to his age and the Republican values he was intended to convey. As Karl Struck aptly observed, the youth wears a costume similar to those worn by the members of the civic body in procession, depicted by Pontormo slightly later in an inset roundel below the feet of the Virgin in the St. Anne altarpiece in the Louvre. This suggests that his attire was meant to convey a role that the youth had been granted in an official body of the Florentine government, quite possibly the motivation for commissioning his portrait at such a young age. Following the devastating sack of Rome, the citizens of Florence took advantage of Clement VII's defeat to exile their Medici overlords and declare a second republic of Savonarolan inspiration. Many Medici partisans abandoned the city at this time, including numerous artists too closely associated with their patronage, such as Baccio Bandinelli. Michelangelo, often thought of today as a staunch Republican, first left the city for Venice, but only returned when the government issued a proclamation that the houses of anyone who had abandoned the city would be confiscated. Pontormo's political outlook is even less clear. As Elizabeth Cropper first observed, no reference to Pontormo as an active participant in the defense of the city during the subsequent siege that returned him to Medici power has been found in any of the numerous contemporary histories of those events, including that written by his friend Benedetto Varchi. Pontormo's notable absence from any list of active Republicans has been confirmed by Alessandro Cecchi in his rigorously documented account of the siege. Unlike other artists closely associated with the Medici, Pontormo remained in the city in 1529 because he had finally managed to purchase the property on which he would subsequently construct his house. This would have been a powerful motivation to remain in the city, as it not only represented a significant financial investment on the part of the artist, but, as Elizabeth Pilliot has observed, one that was also bound to contemporary questions of identity. The period of the siege was a grim moment in the history of Florence. To prevent the enemy armies from using buildings outside the city as defensive positions from which to make incursions, the government enacted a scorched earth policy, ordering all structures within 1 Roman mile of the city destroyed. These included private villas, monasteries and convents, and even tabernacles. We'll come back to the tabernacles. Crops on this land were also destroyed to prevent the enemy from refurbishing their supplies with these, but these would ultimately leave the citizens trapped inside Florence's walls with no supplies of their own, resulting in widespread starvation and poor hygienic conditions that would be followed by another recurrence of the plague immediately following the siege. Under these dire conditions, Pontormo not only managed to survive, but also produced some of his most extraordinary works. With the death of Andrea del Sarto, who survived the siege but succumbed to the plague that broke out immediately after, Pontormo would be recognized by his contemporaries as the greatest painter in Florence. Vasari recalls 2 portraits painted by Pontormo during the siege, of Carlo Neroni and, similmente, nel tempo della sede di Fiorenza, Francesco Guardi in abiti di soldato, che fu opera bellissima. The portrait of Francesco Guardi is today almost universally recognized as the so-called portrait of a halberdier. The painting was first attributed to Pontormo by Hermann Voss in 1920, following its sale in 1904 from the collection of Princess Matilde Bonaparte to the American James Stillman, whose family owned the painting prior to its purchase by the Getty in 1989. Voss correctly identified the subject as Francesco Guardi, following Vasari's description. However, this identification was questioned shortly after by Frank Jewett Mather. According to Vasari's account, the portrait of Guardi had a decorative cover, painted by Bronzino, of Pigmalione che fa orazione a Venere, perché la sua statua, ricevendo lo spirito, s'avviva e divenga, come fece secondo le favole dei poeti, di carne ed ossa. Mather objected to the discrepancy in size between these 2 works, an objection posed by numerous scholars subsequently, including Luciano Berti. Berti, however, subsequently recognized that the difference in the dimensions of the 2 works is almost identical for both the height and the width, approximately 11 centimeters, suggesting that the discrepancy corresponds to what must have been the difference between the width of the original frame of the cover and the rest of the ornamental woodwork surrounding the portrait. Furthermore, as Cropper has observed, the dimensions of the Pygmalion are no longer the original ones, meaning that the difference in size between the cover and the portrait may have been much smaller than in its current state. And you can see evidence for the composition being cut down in the flames rising from Pygmalion's offering, which are cut off at the top of the panel. Similarly, on the right-hand side of the panel, you can see that the sculptor's foot is more or less cut off or cropped in very, very closely. And so we should imagine this whole composition as having been significantly larger. Although other covers from this period are known, few survive as they were originally attached to the portraits they concealed, leaving much room for conjecture, but no reason to doubt this proposal. Herbert Keutner, adopting Mather's objection, however, proposed that Pontormo's masterpiece was instead another portrait recorded by Vasari, depicting the newly elected Duke of Florence, Cosimo I dei Medici, following his 1537 military victory over the Florentine exiles opposed to his rule. As Berti noted in response, this is problematic, as the work belongs to the previous decade of Pontormo's activity stylistically. However, the most contentious area of this vexed scholarly dispute regards the physiognomy of the sitter. Even Janet Cox-Rearick, an ardent defender of the identification of the subject of the portrait as the young Cosimo, was compelled to admit, and I quote, "It is true that it requires a leap of imagination to link the face of the portrait of the Halberdier with later portraits of the Duke." As I have previously observed, all known portraits of Cosimo, from the earliest portrait of him at the age of 12, painted by Ridolfo da Ghirlandaio, to Bronzino's masterful depictions of him over 2 decades of his reign as Duke, as well as the sculpted portraits of him by Baccio Bandinelli and Benvenuto Cellini, depict him affected by strabismus, or exotropia, that is, divergent eyes. Notably, Pontormo did not depict the sitter in the portrait of the Halberdier with this physical characteristic. Furthermore, and this is really, to me, one of the most important indications that this is not a portrait of Cosimo I, Vasari did not use this portrait as a source for his depictions of Cosimo at various historical moments of his life in the decoration of the Quartiere di Leone X in the Palazzo Vecchio, although he did carefully replicate his appearance as a child from Ridolfo da Ghirlandaio's portrait, and his appearance at the moment of his election in 1537 from another portrait by Pontormo, confirming that the Halberdier cannot be a portrait of the young Duke. Certainly, the lack of resemblance to Cosimo cannot be explained away by claiming that the Halberdier is an allegorical portrait. As we have seen, Pontormo produced at least one portrait of this type, but the Halberdier does not contain any allegorical elements other than the meticulously detailed depictions of the youth's costume and accessories. In a magisterial study of the Halberdier written after its acquisition by the Getty, Cropper argued forcefully for the identification of the portrait as the one described by Vasari. Though through a meticulous review of archival and contemporary printed sources, she persuasively suggested that the portrait can only depict Francesco Guardi. 2 of her many arguments are especially important to consider and are rewarded by close looking at the painting in person. The first is the setting of the work. While many portraits from this period have green backgrounds, Pontormo did not employ a green curtain or a more abstracted green space. He carefully depicted the corner bastion of a fortification, something we might expect to be gray or brown. We are therefore compelled to ask why this is shown here as green. The answer is that the fortifications being executed in Florence in 1529, including those designed by Michelangelo, were earthworks. These were constructed so rapidly by the movement of large quantities of earth that they contained grass, shrubs, and even entire trees. Thus, the bastions were quite literally green at the moment of the siege. Indeed, the bastion depicted by Pontormo has been seen by many scholars as a representation of one of those designed by Michelangelo in defense of the short-lived republic around the strategically located church and monastery of San Miniato al Monte, so close by. Cropper is undoubtedly correct that this cannot be intended as a depiction of the Fortezza da Basso behind a portrait of Cosimo. The stones of its main bastion facing toward the city of Florence were carved to depict the balls of the Medici coat of arms in alternation with diamonds, an important family symbol. Even if one were to accept the historical improbability that the young Duke wished to be depicted in front of the fortress, not yet returned to his power in 1537, but occupied by Spanish troops to defend the interests of Charles V, and a significant point of contention between the two until their restitution in 1544, one would have to assume that Cosimo wished to be identified with the Medici symbolism of the fortress's stone revetment. The absence of any such symbol behind the sitter reinforces the rejection of his identification as Cosimo. The setting is important for another reason. The angular form in the background takes its inspiration from a now lost but highly influential composition for a Virgin and Child with the young Saint John the Baptist that once adorned a tabernacle at the end of Borgo Pinti, near one of the city gates to Florence. Due to its location outside the city walls, this was among those structures destined to be demolished in 1529. However, Sarto's fresco was so greatly admired that Piero Capponi, charged with the tabernacle's destruction, ordered his men to preserve it. And this is a fate that happened to another famous work by Andrea del Sarto, which should have been destroyed according to the rules of the Republic, his Last Supper. At San Salvi, thank you very much, at the Cenacolo di San Salvi. So that should have been destroyed. It was saved. The combination of these two works being preserved, in spite of the risks that they presented for offering locations from which to make incursions against the city, suggests the exceptional reputation that Andrea del Sarto had leading up to the siege and during this period. Pontormo, as both a former member of Sarto's workshop and the beneficiary of Capone family patronage, would surely have been aware of this remarkable event, which took place not far from where he bought the property on which he would build his house. Additionally, one of his own frescoes at the monastery of San Gallo, just outside the nearby city gate of the same name, was destroyed when Sarto's tabernacle was saved. Although Sarto's painting no longer survives, it is known through several contemporary copies. We're seeing one here. One of its most unique characteristics was the inclusion of the projecting corner of a walled structure behind the Virgin and Child, while the opposite side of the painting's background featured a slim fragment of a building with a sloped tile roof. And this triangular projection coming out behind the Virgin and Child, with one side cast in light and the other side cast in shadow, is very similar to the compositional idea employed by Pontormo for the background of the Halberdier. He also used it to great effect in the Carmignano Visitation, which was painted around the same time. And the similarity of the backgrounds of these two paintings cannot be casual. That Pontormo's paintings were executed during or close to the siege, at a moment in which such a spirited encomium of his former master's work was made publicly, may suggest why he adapted Sarto's model to his two very different compositions, both as an expression of reverence to the older artist and as an expression of his or his patron's support for the recently reestablished republic. The other essential argument in favor of identifying the Halberdier as a portrait of Francesco Guardi regards the sitter's costume. The portrait is the first significant example in Pontormo's oeuvre of the artist attempting to document contemporary costume meticulously, and to suggest pictorially the tactile qualities of such distinct materials as linen, satin, felt, and leather. In earlier portraits, as we've seen, such as the portrait of a youth in Lucca, Pontormo showed little interest in responding to the stimuli provided by the examples of Raphael and Sebastiano del Piombo's tour de force representations of costumes, textile, leather, and metal. The qualitative leap forward in the representation of clothing in the portrait of a Halberdier suggests that the garments themselves were deemed of great significance. And indeed, Pontormo's only known study for the painting is not a study for the features of the sitter. You can see that it doesn't look anything like him, but it is a study of the costume. The 16th century witnessed extraordinary innovations in military attire as new forms of weaponry rendered armor obsolete. At the vanguard of these innovations were the Swiss and German mercenaries known as the Landsknechts, whose flamboyant attire attracted the attention of numerous artists. The Halberdier's costume is not that of a Landsknecht, but it demonstrates how these influenced Italian military fashions as well. The padded giubbone may have provided much less protection than a metal corselet, but it was lighter and provided a greater range of movement. The garments of the Landsknechts typically featured numerous slashes, as the breeches of the Halberdier also display, precisely to render them more flexible and mobile. Florentines, who had previously preferred to peg mercenary soldiers rather than have their own volunteer militia, were especially concerned to ensure that their sons remained agile to facilitate flight and escape if necessary. There is no question that the garments worn by the sitter in this portrait would have been immediately identified by contemporaries as military attire. The splendor of the costumes worn by the Florentine volunteers was specifically noted by contemporaries. Benedetto Varchi observed that the youths offered a bellissimo spettacolo, magnificently attired and furnished with the latest arms. Especially characteristic of the moment is the depiction of the short hairstyle and beret. Contemporaries specifically noted that the city's youth ceased wearing their hair long to the neck, as had been the previous fashion of the zazzera, but cut it short and started wearing hats. As we have seen, Vasari noted that Pontormo portrayed Francesco Guardi in abito di soldato, the only portrait for which he provided such an explicit indication of costume in his vita of the artist. The description is only justified if we recognize the specificity of the Halberdier's attire and its direct connection to the Tempo dell'Assedio. Once again, the costume confirms that the portrait cannot depict Cosimo, who was explicitly ordered by Clement VII not to wear military-style clothing after the siege, but to assume the traditional attire of Florentine citizens, although he apparently found wearing the mantle known as the lucco intolerable. In any case, no Florentine citizen would have chosen to be represented in a similar costume after the fall of the Second Republic. For similar reasons, most scholars have argued that a related work by Pontormo, the portrait of a young man in a red cap, rediscovered by Francis Russell in 2008, must also date from the period of the siege. The subject has been convincingly identified as Cardinal Neroni, for whom Vasari recorded that Pontormo executed not only his portrait, but also a reduced version of his Saint Acacius and the 10,000 Martyrs during these same years. The almost identical sizes of the two paintings and the poses are so close that some scholars have proposed that Pontormo recycled a cartoon used to paint the Halberdier to paint the young man in the red cap. However, no scientific evidence has yet to emerge to support the hypothesis that Pontormo used complete cartoons in the execution of any of his portraits. And I'm happy to talk more about these technical aspects of how Pontormo executed his portraits in the Q&A after. Saint Acacius was often invoked during periods of plague, and for his composition, Pontormo recycled a drawing he had made around 1522 for the decoration of the chapel of a confraternity dedicated to the 10,000 martyrs in the church of San Salvatore di Camaldo, that was commissioned precisely to thank the saint for his protection, but that, ironically, was never executed due to the recurrence of the plague in Florence in that same year. And that is, of course, just before Pontormo leaves the city to head out to the Certosa di Galluzzo. Pontormo used the drawing as a cartoon for the portion of the composition that corresponds to it in his later panel painting. And Pontormo's, we're talking about this. So this portion of the composition employed this drawing almost certainly as a cartoon. He expanded the composition, however, adding the scenes to the right in the foreground, the emperor condemning Acacius and his troops, and in the background, the crucifixion of the 10,000 on Mount Ararat, executing the underdrawing for these sections freehand. Neroni commissioned a reduced version of this painting, and that's what we're seeing here, identified by Vasari as a work by Pontormo himself, but now almost universally attributed to Bronzino. As this composition corresponds more precisely to Pontormo's earlier composition, the young Bronzino was thus able to employ his master's drawing as a cartoon. It is tempting to imagine that the patron saw both the Halberdier and the larger version of the 10,000 martyrs in the painter's workshop and requested a portrait of himself in the same manner and a partial replica of the religious narrative. The themes of rebellion, sacrifice, martyrdom, and prayer for protection inherent to the subject of Saint Acacius must have resonated powerfully with viewers during the period of the siege. In his portrait, Neroni similarly chose to be depicted in the military fashions of the day, with a padded doublet, short hair, and a smart cap. Neroni is additionally shown wearing a stupendous leather jerkin, a sleeveless garment that would have provided further light protection while allowing for a maximal range of movement due to the great slashes across the body and the smaller ones across the shoulders and above the decorative lappets that emerge from the armholes. Russell made the appealing proposal that the black color of the doublet and jerkin were possibly intended as a play on the sitter's name, Neroni. For all of its similarities to the Halberdier, the young man with a red cap is also very different in mood. Carrying a letter rather than a pole arm and depicted against a neutral background, suggesting an interior, the portrait feels more intimate. Although the inscription on the letter is no longer legible, the gesture of displaying a letter would have confirmed to contemporaries that the sitter had entered maturity and was a person appropriate for positions of responsibility, whether they be commercial or political. For these reasons, Carol Plazzotta has convincingly argued that the portrait was commissioned not only to commemorate Neroni's role as a defender of the Florentine Republic, but also in connection with his marriage, which was celebrated during the siege. His bride, Caterina, was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Florence, Giuliano Capponi, and the niece of Niccolò Capponi, who served as the first gonfaloniere of the Florentine government following the expulsion of the Medici in 1527. Pontormo's remarkable sensitivity to the subjects of his portraits make them compelling to modern viewers, precisely because, even when using a shared compositional idea, he made such sensitive adjustments, endowing each of his sitters with a unique character and allowing them to communicate what was important to themselves at the moment in which they were depicted. For the 15-year-old Guardi, his assumption of a public role, an early entrance into the world of military action and defense of the Republic. For the 19-year-old Neroni, not only his adherence to the Republican cause, but also his assumption of the role of paterfamilias and the establishment of his household. Through his assimilation of novel concepts originating in Venice and Rome, Pontormo developed compositional ideas of his own for portraiture that gave greater monumentality to the figure and a more convincing sense of the sitter's presence and the physical space he occupies. His complete transformation of these sources into a masterful and highly original concept of the portrait occurred during a dramatic moment in Florentine history, the terrible imperial siege waged against the city between 1529 and 1530 to return Florence to the Medici. In documenting the costume and attitude of youths assuming the heroic defense of the Republic, Pontormo created images for which he became universally recognized as one of the greatest portrait painters in early modern European art. Thank you.